Thanks for the MELSIG reference there. And the challenge is now for Calum to talk about the Spice Girls or something of your choosing.
I'll see if I can do that.
Okay. Cheers.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Calum Thomson. I'm an academic developer with the remit for learning technologies at the University of Salford. And I'm going to talk about a piece of research that myself and my colleague Rod Cullen from Manchester Metropolitan University have been looking at, and to do with emerging best practice in webinars, particularly for blended and learning technologies. Now, Rod's also here, but we decided it would be better if two become one, and only I present today. I didn't come preloaded with that at all. Okay, now, I'm aware that Helen spoke about webinars earlier on. I'm probably going to cover some of the same ground there, but I'm going to look more specifically at teaching and how people are using webinars for teaching and learning, and some of the distance I think has been travelled in the last few years, generally, with people that we've spoken to. So to give a bit of a definition, webinars, I'm sure you're aware, is a kind of shortened version of a web-based seminar. When we initially started looking at webinars in a piece of research a couple of years ago, we tried to find a definition, and we found this dictionary definition from 1998, which was, it's a live online educational presentation during which participating viewers can submit questions and comments. And it's quite a nice description, but I think there's a emphasis there on the word presentation, which once we started to look at webinars through this piece of research a couple of years ago, we thought, well, we'll try and write a new definition, because that doesn't quite fit within the more modern view that we have of webinars. So we rewrote this description to be webinars are live interactive teaching and learning activities. I'll not go through the full bit, but really placing more emphasis on the actual activity that's happening within there. So in 2012, myself and Rod, we spoke briefly about this in the discussion just before the break. We ran a series of webinars internally within MMU, most off the back of just realising there wasn't really a lot of expertise in actually delivering teaching and learning courses or delivering structured teaching webinars within the university, and we couldn't find a great deal out there within literature about how you actually do that. So we ran this pilot, and the things that really came back from that, from the evaluation that we did with staff that were involved with it, it was a staff training bit, if anyone doesn't quite remember from before this, the break, was that people were really, they found the flexibility of attending these webinars really great. We, at MMU, we had a split campus, part down in Cheshire, part in Didsbury, part in Hollings, and all sorts. And it meant that people who would have to travel between these places to go to the sessions we were running now didn't, and they could just log in from their desk. And it was all very quick for them, so that was a big selling point for them. We found the strengths of these kind of online conferencing tools for teaching was the interactive tools that were there. So things like being able to share documents and screens and work collaboratively on them, using the chat tools for discussion, polling people from within discussion as well. And what we found out of that was that taking a team teaching approach to these, it was mentioned earlier on, having this team teaching approach where one person can run a main activity or take over a presentation within there, and the other can manage technical issues in the background or gather questions from chat discussion as well. So following on from that, we decided that it would be good to run another piece of research and discuss with people, because we got to a point, I actually left MMU towards the end of last year and took a role at Salford, and we found that although MMU had a fairly new institutional provision for webinars through Adobe Connect, and Salford had a fairly long-term relationship with Blackboard Collaborate and previously Illuminate, that as far as use for teaching and learning, it was at a similar kind of level where both institutions had people who had been doing it for years and using it effectively for distance courses, but there wasn't a widespread use of it within teaching and learning. And I think a lot of that came down to just not an understanding of how the tool could work within that. So what we did was we just put a call out to colleagues and peers who had used webinars. And so to date, this is an ongoing piece of research, but to date we've managed to get around and speak to 12 people at MMU and then 2 further people at Salford now as well. And we thought, well, if we were coming to a webinar as a new webinar user and we wanted to deliver a course and we wanted it to be effective, what would we want to know? And we said, right, well, we want to know about planning, pre-session activities, any staff development involved, delivery and evaluation activities. So we built an interview around this, and we just ran a non-structured interview with each person, which covered these points, and then we ran a thematic analysis of it. And what we looked to pull out of that was, what are the barriers and enablers to people using webinars in the first place? How is it currently being used as a teaching and learning tool, and are there any techniques in there that are useful? And then, how are people evaluating this, and what's the best practice that's being shown within that evaluation? So we talked to a variety of people with a variety of experience. We had some people who've been using it for less than a year, some people who've been using, I think the one person that was over 6 years actually had 13 years experience using the webinars. So we had a wide range of experience. And we spoke to people who were within schools and faculties, the academics that were using this for teaching. Some of them were very new to it, some not so new. We spoke to technology enhanced learning champions. We spoke to the PG CAP academics within both institutions who had been doing some work on these. Centre for Excellence in Learning and Teaching staff and IT services staff. So we've got a pretty broad range of people, broad range of backgrounds, broad range of experience. As far as common teaching use went for it, we broke this down into 4 areas. So you had fully online delivery, which was actually happening more than we thought it might have. We thought it might have been a bit of dabbling, but there were people there who were delivering full online flexible courses for various reasons. We then had support for face-to-face learners, so this was revision activities and support activities out with, so one-to-one Skype discussions. There was blended professional and block delivery approaches, and particularly one thing that came back on a number of occasions was students that are on a sandwich course where they have a year out on placement. Sometimes they lose their community within the course, so they found that using webinars to gather them back together and bring them back together as a community was really effective as to kind of keep them within the course. And then there was also projection of the online classroom as well, and this worked in 2 ways. One was that any students who couldn't make it into a classroom for any reason, the lecturer would set up a webinar and they would just allow the students to be on screen and then a video of the classroom to be projected out again. But also from staff who were delivering courses to commercial partners where they had to travel to go and visit them, they would also sometimes just log in on a webinar on a projector in front of a group like today and then run activities within that group and manage it from the webinar. So there was a number of different uses that people were finding, but the main one we addressed was the fully online delivery. We then spoke to people about planning, and when you speak to teachers about planning, you always get very varied approaches that they have. And this was typical within webinars as well. So we had people, it almost ran along a bit of a spectrum, where people with less experience did more planning. And then people with lots of experience used this, this metaphor came up a number of times, or analogy came up a number of times, of running a radio show, so doing no planning at all, and just asking people to come in and take questions and run a very open session. But the kind of the average point, the middle point of where people sat with planning for webinars was to not to plan to present, but to plan to engage. And by that, what they were doing was they're saying, right, if I've got an hour in a webinar, I'm going to take in 3 outcomes that I want to cover within that webinar, and I'm going to set 20 minutes aside for it, and then I'm just going to let people talk, and I'm going to discuss things in there. And that community and that discussion seemed to be a really rich point that was coming out of it, so people were planning to engage people in that way. As far as any kind of preliminary activity or preparing the staff and the participants, there's 3 points that I've taken here which I thought were quite interesting. The first one is about induction, and a couple of times the Julie Salmon's 5 steps came up, and in particular access and motivation, online socialisation. So giving people, we spoke earlier on about testing and preparing people and allowing them to log in, but that became almost a larger part of the course for people that have been delivering this for a while, because they needed to bring people together and get them used to that environment. So we spoke earlier on about people not really talking to each other and worries about communication, but becoming used to that situation and delivering that situation was really important for teachers and important for students as well. I actually deliver on a flexible distance online learning course at Salford. It's an internal course, but it's all online. And out of 13 weeks, we give over the first 2 weeks to just induction and low-stakes activities where it gets people used to that environment. There's then building that community as well, so like the second step in Julie Salmon's model, the community and socialisation part of it. To support students, what a number of lecturers actually were doing was they were kind of canvassing the students on the course for people who had used webinars before. So a lot of them used Google Hangouts. So they said, right, who's used Google Hangouts before? And some people would come back and say, yes, we've used Google Hangouts. So say, oh, right, okay, these are people that can mentor within Google Hangouts, and then they connect them in that way and get them to kind of peer support each other to get them used to it. And that built not only technical skill, but community, and people start to get to know each other, particularly on distance courses. And then, as we mentioned earlier, beginning with low-stakes activities, so running something like Rod's example earlier on of, upload a slide with images about you to introduce yourself. Nothing that's got any kind of assessment attached to it, nothing that's got any kind of even learning outcome attached to it at all. Just something that people don't feel too threatened by, but they can engage with and be quite relaxed about within that webinar environment. Because a lot of people forget sometimes that it's not only new for the teacher, but it's very new for the participants a lot of the time as well if they haven't engaged with these sessions previously. So I've got a bit of a sore throat, I'm just going to... Activities. Now, activities was the really interesting bit we were keen to find out about. And there were lots of really good examples of activities that came out of there. There was, peer presentations and group work and breakout rooms and creating, whiteboard presentations and things. The main thing that came back from the staff and the people that we interviewed, everyone came back and said, anyone that had any experience came back and said, if you're going to run activities, then focus on the interaction and the collaboration and the dialogue, and don't present. A lot of people, myself included, fall into that way of just presenting within a webinar, maybe running some polls and things throughout it. But in fact, there was a quote within here, which was, if you can deliver any part of that as a video, be it a couple of minutes on YouTube, then why not do that? It's not engaging in the issue that a lot of people ran into with webinars is it's such a passive environment. It's really easy to just switch off. And particularly if the webinar is being recorded, if there's a one-way delivery and it's being recorded, then why wouldn't you just walk away from the computer, make a cup of tea and watch it later at your convenience? So focusing on that dialogue and building in, dialogue, fresh dialogue, steaming heads and exchanges, and that's what to use a webinar for, not to just deliver to people. And finally, we spoke to them about evaluation techniques. And evaluation techniques, again, was an interesting one because you could see a link between the experience that people had. So people that were kind of aspirational, let's say, about evaluation, saw the reason for it and they saw the value of it within a webinar, but they focused more on institutional surveys, focus groups, and taking recordings to be observed by people and receive feedback later. But those with more experience and, to be honest, did less planning for the webinars, had techniques to be really responsive to students. So they had, for example, back-channel chat, and the moderator would watch that and prompt for feedback through that and almost evaluate as they were moving along. And also having a moderator there who's watching any activity that's going on, watching how the tutor is working within that environment and giving feedback so that they can change and react and respond. Again, because of the passive nature potentially of a webinar and the ease of walking away from it, managing to keep people engaged was really important, so you had to be quite responsive. So giving a quick overview of these recommendations, this was where, when we start to look at this as a whole, it became really interesting because what people were saying to recommend to peers was, when you're planning, plan to present, or don't move away from planning to present, sorry, and plan to engage people in that space. You've got a space, you've got time with students, kind of keep it really engaging for people. Support the access and get people socialised in that group and build a community within that group. And community was a word that came up a lot. Get people talking to each other. And avoid delivering didactically within the classroom. Get that outside of the webinar and use the time that you have to actually engage students. I don't know if anyone's finding that this sounds a little bit familiar. And evaluate in real time and change that environment and keep it dynamic. And we thought, well, this is kind of just good teaching. And the discussions that me and Rod have had are, if you could design a teaching space, the tools that you get within a webinar are really the kind of tools that you'd look to put within the teaching space anyway, polling tools and interactive whiteboards and things. So this really came back round when one of the people I interviewed turned around and said to me, the irony is that, that you think, well, if I can do that in a webinar, then I can do that in a classroom, less of a broadcast lecture, more interactive engagement, so it's actually changing and improving my classroom behaviour as well. So people that were using webinars were being forced into this way of creating a more engaging, less passive environment, and it was having a positive impact on what they were doing in the classroom. Okay, I whizzed through that, but just because I'm aware it's just before lunch. But does anyone have any questions? Well, we've got some questions for you, and I know there were people stuck up their hand earlier on and said they were using webinars. So we would like to speak to you about this and just continue this and get a wider pool of data about what people are doing and what they're finding works for them within webinars as well. Yes? Yeah.
Did you sort of look at or come across the issue of sort of student resistance to this? Because what some of our tutors find is that when they try to do something that's much more interactive, there are some students who are just a bit more like, no, we just want you to tell us. And actually resist that as well.
Our experience with delivering is that creating the more like engaging environment, it keeps people interested in it. Now, I'm not sure how that would be with a group of students who weren't colleagues. Because we've dealt a lot with colleagues. I teach on an internal training course basically, and the evaluation we did previously was with colleagues as well. But we did get the impression that engaging people in this way and getting them to engage with webinar and with the tools that are there. There's so many different tools there that they can engage through, so you can get them to be very creative and hands-on, you can get them to chat, you can get them to use video and audio, and they find a way that suits them within there, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
We've been really surprised at just how much goes on in the chat room, and one of the things in talking to a relatively small number of students is that there is almost a perception that we can have a conversation in the chat room you wouldn't be able to have if you were sat in the classroom. So we're seeing a lot more interesting dialogue going on in those chat rooms than perhaps we would in a classroom environment. And we've got better evidence that those students are engaged in the webinar than we have in a classroom environment.
There's an interesting point as well that was made in one of the interviews that we did, which was when you have this chat going on, how much do you kind of manage that? And because there was someone that we're talking to was saying that they'd invited in a guest speaker to do a quick presentation, and the students were so used to talking to each other within that environment and just chatting that there was all this chat going on, and it wasn't even about what the guy was talking about. So it was quite off-putting for him. It was like, well, is that rude, or do you just accept that there's potentially a lot more learning going on in the chat than there is in the actual presentation that's there at the time?
Okay. I mean, that's a good point to end on. Yeah, it's all about learning, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But thank you very much, Calum, for that.